Well, it's 1:31, so I figured we might as well get started. I apologize for my non-spectacular background. I'm here at the parsonage at Hillside in El Cerrito, California. And yeah, it's really good to see you. In a way, I figured this would give you a taste of what our gatherings are often like at Hillside, which, I figured, the mini course kind of almost sounds like another lecture, which is awesome. And, we've had amazing lectures and, I really enjoyed Gary Lockman's talk yesterday. If you haven't had a chance yet to check it out, really excellent. And he talked actually about some of the figures that I'm about to talk about for a moment. But what I figured is that this would not be a lecture, this would not be a class, but this would be kind of a time to absorb some ideas and then to kind of put them in action and contemplate them in a meditative style. So that's kind of what we do at Hillside is we on most Sundays we will read several readings from. There's always a Swedenborg in there. There's usually a scripture reading in there, and there's usually another mystic in there. And we kind of just take about a minute, 2 minutes of silence to just sit with those readings each. And we have time constraints, of course. But what I figured we would do together is I have just a couple of figures that stand out for me as a nice sampling of mystics, some of the great mystics, some of the great mystical writings. And this will be very superficial and brief. But what I'll do is I'll give a very short sort of presentation on what is mysticism, and I will then really quickly give you a taste of the couple of folks / works that we will be engaging with. Again, this will be very superficial, and I hope that if something speaks to you that maybe you weren't aware of before, that you then go ahead. There's amazing literature, obviously, out there. But, and then we will simply go through that meditative contemplative time together where I have a reading for each of the folks we will be talking about, and we'll simply have, in a sense, a lectio divina, where we simply hear and receive and meditate on each of those phrases. So, yeah, I think that's a pretty good intro on what we're about to do. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm assuming everybody can see and hear me and the slides.
Yep, we can see the slides and we can hear you.
Excellent. Great. Be awkward if I'm just kind of babbling to myself. Not that that's ever happened before. So yeah, welcome again to this short little time that we'll have to hopefully kind of take a break actually from some of the mental gymnastics, which of course are really beautiful. We've done a lot of excellent work with our minds and we've learned a lot of great things. And I hope that we will do a little bit of that, but mostly have an experience of centering and of taking a break, going within. I think we've all earned it. I know many, if not most of you, have been really busy past few days, if not weeks, getting ready for convention and leading things. So I figured I would start with this quote. This is from Manly Palmer Hall. He's kind of the more eccentric figures in the more recent Western esoteric tradition. He's written a lot of really cool stuff on mysticism and the Western esoteric tradition. He was very familiar with the old Swede. Experiences are the chemicals of life with which the philosopher experiments. I think this expresses a sentiment that underlies all, if not most, if not all, mystical traditions and mystical thought and experience is that there is something inherently experiential about mysticism that sets it apart from, say, theology. You can have theology in a very intellectual way. And it's interesting because Swedenborgians tend to refer to all of Swedenborg's published theological works as theological works, when it has certainly theology in it, but a lot of it is really mystical works. And we'll go a little bit into the distinction between what that is. I'm not going to bother with this for too long. I just figured I'd give a quick sort of overview, and you can just kind of absorb this of some of the different definitions. There's really not one universal definition of what mysticism is. You can see they actually kind of vary. Oxford has one belief that union with or absorption into the deity or absolute or spiritual apprehension of knowledge inaccessible to the intellect may be attained through contemplation and self-surrender. Belief characterized by self-delusion or dreamy confusion of thought, especially when based on the assumption of occult qualities or mysterious agencies. So you can see how, it already starts these very different connotation with what mysticism is. Once you get into the sort of philosophical and theological work, people that look more deeply into this field and into this concept of what mysticism is, a purportedly super sense perceptual or sub-sense perceptual experience in granting acquaintance of realities or states of affairs that are of a kind not accessible by way of sense perception. Somatosensory modalities or standard introspection. So again, this is kind of just theological babble in a way, but I think you might be getting a broad idea of what we're speaking about. There's these different themes that are focused in all of these definitions. One is the idea of transcendence. The other is the idea of experiential experience of the divine. There's the idea of union. And I actually I'm going to kind of jump around here. This is kind of the list that and of course, I'm not unique at all in pointing these things out, but after looking at all of these different definitions and ideas of what mysticism is, I personally kind of have come away with these characteristics that characterize mysticism as opposed to a lot of other states or experiences. One is that it is a direct experience. It is an intimate experience. There is a numinous or a transcendent element to it, which means that it is something that is beyond comprehension, not only natural comprehension, but in a sense also the comprehension of the person experiencing. It tends to be multi-sensory, so it's not just visions or what have you. A lot of times mystical experiences would be very diverse sensory perceptions, including taste, smell, hearing, visions. Of course, Swedenborg is a great example of someone who experienced all of those. They tend to be ecstatic or rapturous. Swedenborg is also a great example of that. They tend to be esoteric. And by that, in one theological sense, it's really meant esoteric as opposed to exoteric. It's something that is focused on the inner realms rather than the outer realms. Again, Swedenborg is a great example, actually, of an esoteric tradition. When you look at his cosmology of God as one in the center, compared to the sun radiating outward. The further you go inward, the more multiplicity dissipates, and the more you enter towards union with that ultimate divine. So once again, Swedenborg is a pretty great example of that. And it tends to be monistic. That doesn't mean that it only happens to monotheists or to theists to begin with, but monistic in the sense that there is an aspect of unity, of oneness that you can see across mystical literature. There seems to be some kind of focus on a universal, not only connectedness, but a oneness, a union. I like Michael Cox's idea of defining mysticism as the direct experience of God. He's not unique in that, but that's another term that's sort of really brief. That, in a way, I think is a decent description. And I am going to share some Swedenborg. And the reason I am taking this time as the sort of more intellectual part of the presentation to read some Swedenborg is the Journal of Dreams, I think, is a great example of direct documentation that is unpolished, in which Swedenborg actually describes these very intimate personal experiences, which he then kind of puts in a more presentable package in his consequent works that he actually published. And this is from the very initial stages of Swedenborg's transformation from a scientist to a mystic, to what makes us all gather here today, in a sense. I'm just going to move this a little bit. At 10 o'clock, I went to bed. Half an hour afterwards, I heard a noise beneath my head, and I then thought that the tempter had departed. Immediately there came over me a powerful tremor from the head and over to the whole body, together with a resounding noise, and this occurred a number of times. I found that something holy had encompassed me. I then fell asleep, but at about 12, 1, or 2 o'clock in the night, there came over me a very powerful tremor from the head to the feet, accompanied with a booming sound as if many winds had clashed against one another. It was indescribable, and it shook me and prostrated me on my face. In the moment that I was prostrated, I became wide awake, and I saw that I had been thrown down. I wondered what it meant, and I spoke as if I were awake, but still found the words were put into my mouth, and I said, O thou Almighty Jesus Christ, who of thy great mercy deignest to come to so great a sinner, make me worthy of this grace. I kept my hands folded and I prayed, and then there came forth a hand which strongly pressed my hands. I then continued my prayer, saying, Thou hast promised to receive in grace all sinners. Thou canst not otherwise than keep thy words. In the same moment, I was sitting at his bosom and beheld him face to face. It was a countenance of a holy mien, and all was such that it cannot be expressed, and also smiling, so that I believe that his countenance was such also while he lived in the world. He spoke to me and asked if I had a bill of health. I answered, Lord, thou knowest better than I. He said, well, then do. This I found in my mind to signify, love me truly. So this, just one of Swedenborg's countless mystical experiences, it's just like a classic textbook example. It really is just not only, I think, a very beautiful example, but it's you know, you could look at this just this text, and I think scholars would agree that it checks off all of those marks generally associated with mysticism. So there's a couple of readings today, and again, this is not meant to be a lecture, so I'm just going to give you a super brief overview of each of the folks that we will be citing. And it took me forever to decide who actually to pick, because there's just, through all of the ages, literally, you know, there has always been an inner mystical tradition, and there's just so many beautiful examples. So I picked the ones that I picked because I felt that they were a good illustration of some of the diversity that exists within the different mystical traditions. But of course, this is only a tiny little scratch. So I really do hope this encourages folks to go on a journey of their own, both mentally and experientially. First one you probably have heard of. He's super popular and has actually continuously risen in popularity in the West. This is Rumi, very famous for little prints that we put on our walls, etc., etc. Comes from, of course, the Islamic tradition, the Sufi tradition. He was he was Persian, and lived in the 13th century. One of the things that makes Rumi stand out is not only was he a polymath, he was one of those Renaissance men who wasn't, of course, in the Renaissance, um, who very much exemplifies the poetic aesthetic side of mysticism. He has a beautiful kind of, in a sense, proto-universalism. And this is another thing that's really common in different mystical traditions, is that while they are rooted in a specific tradition, the further you go inward, you could say, the more distinctions clash. And that implication exists to various degrees in all of these different traditions, is that the further you go in, the more external creeds and dogmas kind of lose some of their significance. The Cloud of Unknowing is another one of my personal favorites. It's from an anonymous author, which is kind of cool if you think about that. Of course, Swedenborg did that too at the beginning, and so did a lot of other mystics. Late 14th century England, again, we don't know where it's from. There's different theories. It is a great example of Christian esoteric as well as Christian mysticism. In this sense, esotericism, in the sense of this is something that is, again, in the esoteric, exoteric distinction, that is, this is something that is reserved to folks who are willing to take that inner journey. There's almost an initiatory kind of element. I do not willingly and deliberately read it, copy it, speak of it, or allow it to be read, copied, or spoken of by anyone or to anyone, except by or to a person who, in your opinion, has undertaken truly and without reservation to be a perfect follower of Christ. And the Cloud of Unknowing is a great example of focuses on that theme of transcendence, that ultimately the deepest experience of God is not an intellectual experience. It's not something that is confined to the mind or even the body. Some would call it the mind-body complex that is transcended. So, and once again, why it's very much Christian in its language. It's something that folks have resonated with across tradition, and it's been popular across mystical tradition because once you get into it, once you get beyond the semantics, and the very point of it is that there is something about the experience of God that transcends all knowledge. St. Hildegard of Bingen is another wonderful example of kind of, I think, I talked about the multisensory element. She was a German mystic, 11th century, 12th century, Benedictine abbess, and she was a polymath. She was a Renaissance woman, as we would call it now. Like Swedenborg, like John Dee, like Meister Eckhart, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she has this beautiful visionary theology where she does, in a way that's not too different from Swedenborg in a sense, she has a combination of very elaborate mystical visions that again are multi-sensory with a very sort of clear and structured theological intellectual approach. Another thing that's really cool about St. Hildegard is that, you know, she's been venerated for centuries and centuries in different regions and in different communities. And it wasn't until 2012 that Pope Benedict, of all people, declared her a doctor of the church, which is sort of a post, a quasi canonization that happens after someone's basically been a saint already. I really encourage you to check out both her literary work and her art. And there's also amazing music that she composed. So YouTube Hildegard of Bingen, and you will be amazed, I think, and touched. St. John of the Cross is another one of the great Christian mystics, Spanish dude. He was a Carmelite priest. And again, he was very much grounded in the world in the sense that he was very active in the life of his order. And he was also a brilliant theologian. He really stands out as another person who incorporated these very, very profound mystical experiences into his engagement with theology. You may be familiar with The Dark Night of the Soul, which I really encourage you to read. It's really beautiful engagement with the experiences of spiritual darkness as something that moves us forward in our regeneration. And he, he's a cool dude. He's awesome. You should check him out. And you'll get a taste of him in just a little bit. I don't really have to talk about Emanuel Swedenborg. I assume all of y'all really know your Sweetie Bears. Krishnamurti. I kind of skipped a whole century there, and that's not because there isn't a lot of amazing stuff, but it's because, again, I wanted to give a pretty broad overview. Krishnamurti stands out, again, around the theme of unknowing, of transcending knowledge, as someone who went pretty radical with that. It has a just amazing, fascinating story that almost sounds kind of like a Disney movie plot. He was basically discovered by a group of theosophists in India as a young boy. And he was believed to be an incarnation of a new world teacher. You might have heard of the idea of a bodhisattva. It exists in different traditions, but basically the idea was that this guy was chosen to be this new world teacher. And so he was very carefully groomed and spoiled and trained as a youth, and sort of prepared for this experience, for that mission of being this new world teacher. And what's beautiful about Krishnamurti is he completely rejected all of it at one point. He dissolved the efforts to fund and organize his mission, and his teaching ended up focusing on full presence, on the abandonment of concepts, of dogmas, of language, even of thought, even as the ultimate experience of the ultimate. He used different, he evolved in his language. And again, fascinating story. And, he can come across as, I'm trying to stay PG-13. He comes across kind of arrogant sometimes, but he is, I believe, a true mystic. And I think that a lot of his mission is to kind of wake us up from a lot of our BS. Another very popular and I think really beautiful example of mysticism would be A Course in Miracles. And one of the reasons I chose the Course in Miracles as an example is not only because it's contemporary in a sense, but also because it combines the sort of numinous transcendental experience with a very applicable system of living mysticism. So just the very basics, the Course in Miracles was scribed, you could say channeled, revealed to a psychologist who actually came from a secular background, Helen Schuckmann, through what she claimed was essentially Christ consciousness. It was published anonymously in 1972. There's three main parts. There's a text, the workbook for students, the manual for teachers. And again, it's a fascinating story. It's baffling considering her background, and it's weird. The concept is weird, but once you read the text, it is, I find, quite beautifully simple, and it, to me, in a way, encompasses a lot of the mystical teachings that we see preceding it. So for Swedenborgian, I think a lot of the concepts will sound very Swedenborgian. And I think a lot of, for a Buddhist, it may sound very Buddhist. It's very Christian in its language. I think it might be one of the clearest examples of Christian non-dualism, of a very sort of radical idea of oneness as the core of all that is, and the core of the divine, and the core of our true spiritual nature. And what we will now go ahead and do, if you would like, is move into a bit more of a meditative, contemplative space. So I invite you to, just make yourself comfortable wherever you are seated or standing, or maybe let's see that there's not too much tension in our bodies. Let's, if we'd like to, close our eyes, focus on something in the room. Take some deep breaths. Let's acknowledge all that we are sensing in this very moment. The sounds. I can hear a fridge and a dog. I hope you can't hear them too loudly. Just observe the sounds around you without judgment, perhaps even without meaning making. All our physical sensations. Let's be fully present in this very moment. And now let's see if we can open our inner ears, our angelic ears, and simply be present in the moment and observe and absorb the readings for today. This is from Rumi, from one of his major works, the Divan-e-Shams. From left and right, pass us by. We'll return to the world above. Such fate no one can defy. We have come from the skies, befriended angels in heaven. To the same place we will rise, to that city past skies, heaven, 7. We are above the skies, and angels we transcend. Why should we compromise? The house of songs is our end. Kind of a beautiful English transliteration there. We'll now have just a short moment of silent meditation as we reflect on and absorb that particular reading. From the Cloud of Unknowing. God can certainly be loved, but not thought. He can be taken and held by love, but not by thought. From St. John of the Cross. I entered into unknowing. Yet when I saw myself there, without knowing where I was, I understood great things. I shall not say what I felt, for I remained in unknowing, transcending all knowledge. This knowledge in unknowing is so overwhelming that wise men disputing can never overthrow it. For their knowledge does not reach to the understanding of not understanding, transcending all knowledge. And this supreme knowledge is so exalted that no power of man or learning can grasp it. From Emanuel Swedenborg. Anyone who has not experienced heaven's peace cannot know what the peace is that angels enjoy. As long as we are in our bodies, we cannot accept heaven's peace. So we cannot perceive it. Our perception being on the natural level. In order to perceive it, we need to be the kind of person who, as to thought, can be raised and taken out of the body. Since I have perceived heaven's peace in this way, I can describe it, but not in words as it really is. Because human words are not adequate. Using words, I can only describe what it is like compared to that peace of mind that people have who are content in God. Divine peace is within the Lord, arising from the oneness of his divine nature. The divine quality of peace in heaven comes from the Lord, arising from his union with heaven's angels, and specifically from the union of the good and the true within each angel. These are the sources of peace. We may therefore conclude that peace in the heavens is the divine nature intimately affecting everything good there with blessedness. So it is the source of all the joy of heaven. In its essence, it is the divine joy of the Lord's divine love, arising from his union with heaven and with every individual there. This was, I believe, Heaven and Hell 284, by the way. From Jiddu Krishnamurti. Truth is a pathless land, and you cannot approach it by any path whatsoever, by any religion, by any sect. That is my point of view, and I adhere to that absolutely, and unconditionally. Truth being limitless, unconditioned, unapproachable by any path whatsoever, cannot be organized. From chapter 2 of A Course in Miracles, I think it's actually chapter 8. Knowledge is not the motivation for learning this course. Peace is. This is the prerequisite for knowledge, only because those who are in conflict are not peaceful. And peace is the condition of knowledge, because it is the condition of the kingdom. The ego's voice is a hallucination. You cannot expect it to say, I am not real. Yet you are not asked to dispel your hallucinations alone. You are merely asked to evaluate them in terms of their results to you. If you do not want them on the basis of loss of peace, they will be removed from your mind for you. I invite you to simply be with however these readings spoke with you, however they made you feel. Again, perhaps without judgment, perhaps without even too much thought. Let's simply be with how we are this moment. Now, if I didn't have a book recommendation list, I wouldn't be a proper Swedenborgian minister. So if this is a topic that interests you, there's a lot of obviously great literature out there. There's a few books on mysticism that I think are really useful if you want a broad understanding of the Western esoteric tradition. And I'm going to go through the ones that immediately stuck out as, oh, I want to recommend these to people. One is actually by our wonderful keynote speaker from yesterday, Gary Lockman. He's written excellent books on different mystics, different esoteric figures for a long time, and this is a great sort of compendium of talking about some of these figures more in depth. And I'm going to try to shut this dog up for a second. 1 second. The Reverend Alex Rush is out there guarding the dog, and he is being somewhat successful at it. Another one that's great if particularly Christian mysticism interests you. The Modern Library came out with a really nice, really cheap paperback in 2006, which gives you an excellent overview of Christian mysticism in the form of actually introducing you to some of the essential writings of Christian mysticism. Another one that has a very clear Swedenborgian connection would be Wilson Van Dusen's, really any of Wilson Van Dusen's work. There's a really cool short book that the Swedenborg Foundation brought out a few years ago, Beauty, Wonder, and the Mystical Mind, which is another excellent example of someone's engagement. He, of course, looks at the psychological angle of stuff as well. Evelyn Underhill's book, Mysticism, kind of one of the classics, and I do highly just recommend it. She's an amazing scholar, and she this is kind of like the I wouldn't say definitive work, but it's something that may or may not be the most popular overview of mysticism from a scholarly perspective that's also really accessible. So Evelyn Underhill. Richard Smoley is another author that I highly recommend. He actually served at the Swedenborg Foundation board for quite a while. He is not affiliated with any Swedenborgian groups, but he's a huge fan of and scholar of Swedenborg, and very much brings him into dialogue with the broader Western esoteric tradition and the broader mystical tradition. And he's written several really good things. An older one is Hidden Wisdom, a guide to the Western inner traditions. There's a more recent one that focuses more specifically on Christian mysticism. And that one is called Inner Christianity, a Guide to the Esoteric Tradition, which, again, excellent work if that's kind of what you're into. And I do apologize for the Eurocentric bias here. I'm sharing this, the Western esoteric tradition has been a passion of mine, so that's why I'm focusing on that. But I'm very excited that we've had at least 2 mini courses this convention that have had a direct engagement with Eastern mysticism.
Hey, Tom, we got to wrap this up in the next minute or so that the next mini course will be coming in.
Excellent. Sweet. So this is basically perfect timing then. Yeah, one thing that we're missing, of course, that we would have at Hillside now is we would have a discussion. But I'm hoping that this will be food for thought and perhaps food for conversation. Maybe we'll have another chance to socialize during the virtual convention. And I'm obviously always happy to nerd out about mysticism and the Western esoteric tradition. So I hope that this was a good way for you to take a break in a sense. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. And that's my main hope, that it was a source for centering. And thank you all for coming, and thank you for being at this convention and doing this awesome work together.